Hello again. Today we're continuing our series in the book of Genesis, looking at Genesis chapters 37 through 41 and the first part of Joseph's story. We'll conclude the book of Genesis in a special Saturday edition tomorrow. In our previous devotional, we considered Jacob Israel and his passion for the blessing of God. We know that he is the bearer of the great promises of nation, land, and blessing, God's people in God's place in relationship with him. But from Genesis 37 onwards, attention turns to Jacob Israel's sons. And we wonder if only one son is the bearer of God's promises or if collectively they all inherit them. In Genesis 35, we're told that Jacob Israel has 12 sons, and Genesis 37 draws our attention to the second youngest of these sons, to Joseph, who is Israel's favourite. He gets the fancy coat while the others get to look after the sheep and the goats. The narrative of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat it's well known, isn't it? So let's just recap it quickly before we dig a little deeper into this narrative. If you haven't already, you might like to read it all in Genesis chapters 37 through 41 and perhaps even to the end of the book. But in short, Joseph's 10 older brothers hate him because he is his father's favourite. And he tells Israel what a bad job they are doing of the shepherding of Israel's flocks. Oh, and they hate him because he tells them that he has had a dream, and in his dream he rules over all of them while they all bow down to him. And so the 10 older brothers decide to kill Joseph, but then they decide to sell him as a slave to some traders who on-sell him to an Egyptian named Potiphar. Things go pretty well with Joseph in charge until Potiphar's wife frames him. So Joseph ends up in Pharaoh's jail, where again he proves himself a trustworthy and excellent manager, while also interpreting dreams for Pharaoh's butler and his baker. Now, after rotting in jail for 2 more years, Pharaoh has some dreams, and Joseph gets the call up to interpret 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh then puts Joseph in charge to manage his affairs, and once again things go exceedingly well. So that's the narrative up to chapter 41, with which I'm sure many of us are familiar. So let's just consider then the theme of injustice and falsehood that we see in these chapters. Already in Genesis we've seen many lies and injustices. Very often the narrator makes no judgment about the wrongness, the downright sinfulness of these actions. But in time, as the narrative develops, we see the consequences and the fruits of these actions. Jacob Israel ensures that he gets his way through deceitfulness and manipulation. He opportunistically squeezes Esau to sell his birthright. He and Rebekah deceive Isaac to steal the old man's blessing. Then he does some funky things with Laban's sheep and goats to become very wealthy. He comes across as a scammer. He's not to be trusted until that turning point where God meets with him on the way back to his family home. So is that the end of the lies and deception? Not at all. Jacob Israel seems to get as good as he gave. Laban swapped daughters on him, remember? His own sons trick him into believing his favourite son had been eaten by a wild animal. Among his sons, the same crooked dealing and deception continue. They're going to kill Joseph, but Reuben plans to rescue him, but then Judah sells him before Reuben can act. There's a whole chapter describing Judah's crooked dealings and adultery, prostituting his daughter-in-law before condemning her to death for doing so. His sons are so bad, they suffer God's immediate judgment. And so we cannot help but call all of this out. How can the chosen family of God be so crooked? They just seem so undeserving of all of the rich promises of blessing that God has bestowed upon Abraham. It seems that throughout Genesis, two themes are intertwined: the promises of God and the unworthiness, and sometimes the downright sinfulness, of the recipients of these promises. But by the time we arrive at Genesis 37, we're accustomed to this incongruous mix: God's promise and the unworthiness of his chosen people. But then we meet Joseph. Sure, he's that annoying younger brother, he's daddy's favourite, and that's not his fault. And everywhere Joseph goes, no matter what happens to him, he seems to experience injustice. He's the pawn in everybody else's game. The deception and manipulation continue, and he's the one wearing the consequences. He's sold as a slave, and so he becomes the best slave he can be. He's set up, falsely accused and dumped into jail by Potiphar's wife, so he becomes the best prisoner he can be. He interprets dreams for his fellow prisoners, but the baker forgets about him and leaves him to rot in jail for another couple of years before he does anything to help him out. What impresses about Joseph is his character. In the face of injustice, when everything just goes wrong, when he maintains godliness, truthfulness and integrity, we see his character. In the Genesis narrative, at last, we seem now to have a character of promise, someone of whom we might say, well, he seems to be the kind of person we would want to inherit the promises of God. So let's ask this question: what's Joseph's secret? How does he do it? What is his mindset, his view of life that enables him to continually represent God and bring his blessing wherever he goes? Well, I noticed some clues in Joseph's interactions with Pharaoh. When Joseph gets the call up to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, well, if he does well, maybe this is his ticket out of jail. Let's see what he will say. Genesis 41, so Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon where he'd been. When he had been shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Think about it. Hey Joe, can you interpret my dreams? No, sir. What? Why are you wasting Pharaoh's time? No, says Joseph. But God will. You see, at this turning point, once again, Joseph is completely at God's service, not Pharaoh's. Joseph is convinced that God is absolutely sovereign, that he is in control, not just of Pharaoh's dreams, but of his own entire life, in every part. Notice how he responds to Pharaoh, even after the interpretation of the dream, verse 28. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, at this point, Joseph has no idea what's about to happen to him. Pharaoh might just say, well, thanks very much, Joe, and send him back to jail. But because Joseph knows that God is in control, that Pharaoh is entirely in God's hands, he's prepared to trust God's sovereign plan. There is no manipulation, there is no deception. It is at this point that Pharaoh says, well, perhaps surprisingly, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning as wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So who's Joseph now? He's not some slave found in the bottom of a dungeon jail cell. According to Pharaoh, he is a man in whom is the Spirit of God. The word for God on Pharaoh's lips is not Osiris or Isis or Re, none of the Egyptian pantheon. Notice it's the Hebrew name for God, Elohim, divine majesty, the living God. the name used very often of God throughout the book of Genesis. So Joseph is identified with God, and his wisdom and his ability come from God alone because Joseph trusts him, knowing God is in control of every situation, of every injustice and every ruler. Will his brothers ever bow down to him? Well, God has given him that dream, but Joseph trusts God to bring it all about. Unlike his father, Jacob Israel, he doesn't need to resort to deception or manipulation. Instead, he trusts God for everything. And so, as we reflect on Joseph and his journey, and at least this first part, we are challenged to live under the sovereignty of God, to abandon deception and manipulation, and instead to simply commit ourselves to living God's way. God's promises continue, but the way we live in response to them is the true narrative of our lives. Regardless of whether we are slaves or prisoners or prime ministers, what really matters is our readiness to act and make decisions based on His promises to us in Christ Jesus. Something to think on today. Where are you challenged to manipulate circumstances in your favour? What would trusting God and His promises look like in that situation? I encourage you to pray about this now and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for the conclusion of our series on Genesis.